Thank you, Jennifer. What a wonderful way to start. Roe versus Wade was a landmark legal decision issued January 22nd, 1973. Flash forward, June 24th, 2022, Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe on a 5-4 vote. The dissenting justices' last words leave no doubt to their feelings over the majority's decision. Quote, "In overruling Roe and Casey, this court betrays its guiding principles. With sorrow for this court, but more for the many millions of American women who have today lost a fundamental constitutional protection. We dissent." Nearly a third of American women, around 21 million, lost access to abortion immediately after the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Indeed, we are ruthless. When it came down, obviously it does not affect me personally anymore, but it really hit me like a gut punch. It was very emotional for me and women all over America. But good morning to those of you here in the sanctuary and to those viewing online. My name's Terry Cross. I'm serving as your worship associate this Labor Day weekend. I'm a retired UAW member, as were my parents. Hired in when I was 19, retired when I was 49. I feel blessed every day, and my union made this possible. Today, unions have their highest approval rating since 1965. About half of all non-union workers say they would join a union if given the chance. That is almost 60 million people. Powerful stuff. I heard on the drive in here on NPR, Barbara Enright, the author of Nickel and Dimed in America, passed away this week. Barbara, who wrote on labor and the classes, wrote that there's no such thing as unskilled labor. As a member of UUCF, in fact, my church anniversary date was this past week, August 30th, 2013, and I'm thankful to belong to a church that speaks to the social justice issues of our times. This week's lay-led service, Backlash, Overturning Roe, is presented by UUCF member Sheila Smith. While working with Sheila on this service, I found out that her sister, Connie Smith, was the first woman elected president of an amalgamated union in Michigan. She won that first election by 7 votes. Your vote matters. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Connie also started the Women's Caucus of Communication Workers of America and twice chaired the Saginaw County Democratic Organization. Our ministers, Lynn and Jerry Kerr, will be back in the pulpit next week. If our faith is new to you, you can find out more at uuflint.org or visit us on Facebook or contact one of our ministers, Reverend Lynn or Jerry Kerr at the church office. Further insights can be found at uua.org. A few announcements. What are you doing this afternoon at 5 p.m.? There will be a jazz concert here in the social hall at 5 p.m. Ben Turner Organ Trio, and the snack food is great. It's provided by Ken from Good Beans. And a good way to thank Ken would be by attending Goodstock next Saturday, September 10th from 3 to 9 p.m. at Good Beans Cafe. A free evening, bring a chair, enjoy small batch root beer and local music. And the headline act is Professor Joe Wright and Friends. I went to high school with those guys. And are you looking for a social justice project? Want to find your passion in volunteering? Need a one-time, one-and-done opportunity to do good? We have them all. Get information, sign up at the Helping Hands Fair in the weeks of September 11th after the service during coffee hour. If you're online or can't make it, feel free to contact one of our ministers or Kathy Stiles. September 28th, join Jerry and Lynn to discuss a critically acclaimed book that has an unusual cast of characters, all of them Unitarian Universalists. I think we could write a book about this place. What do you think? There's plenty of humor. It's called Search, Plenty of opportunities to laugh as we learn about ourselves. The book's a work of fiction, the kind that tells the absolute truth. 2022 Flint Area Crop Walk is back. Thank you, Pam Pinty, for your years of collecting monies on the walk to end world hunger. This year, Chris Monk and myself will be recruiting fellow walkers and soliciting contributions to support this event. I have many good memories of my days at Woodside doing Crop Walk. It was always an annual event. Last year I did it, was walking with my church kids. And it's a good cause. They changed the route. It's only 3 miles. It will be October 2nd, 2 p.m., and location Court Street Methodist. You can see me after church for more details. So, and contrary to what you might guess, we don't ask our in-person audience to turn off your phones. You can silence them, of course, but consider going to our YouTube channel, pull up the service, and say hello to online volunteers. And we will now light our chalice. The Womb, written by Sheila Smith. My hot-blooded mother, drop by drop, schooled me in her womb. With deep red embers, she etched the epic of all womb bearers, passing their wisdom down to daughter after daughter, drop by drop. And now if you please recite the covenant with me all together. Recognizing the richness of diversity, the beauty and wonder of shared worship, and the transforming power of love and service, we gather as a sacred, intentional community to freely seek knowledge and truth, to celebrate the fullness of life, and by our actions to increase goodness and justice.
Opening word today are a poem I wrote when the ERA fell to defeat. It's called June 30th, ERA and Hope. Grieve. It seems appropriate when hope limped like a bloodied wife away from law's empty promise. Grieve. We owe at least that much to a chance lost like Gretel at the hands of her father and a brother who is no help. Mourn, but women know 1,000 secrets now, and where to go with feelings that are fist-hard sad.
And please join us to sing. And you can stand if you'd like. Shall we start all together on verse 1? As we come marching,
This is a reading from a book called Trust Women, a Progressive Christian Argument for Reproductive Justice by Rebecca Todd Peters, who is a minister and a social ethicist. When she was in college, her parents, her father being a minister, came to visit her. And she told her parents that she decided she was pro-choice. But she said, but I would never personally have an abortion. Her mother said to her, why not? You should never have a baby just because you're pregnant. You should only have a baby if you want to be a mother. And this reading is kind of a reflection on that instant for her. She said, the comment I made to my parents that I was pro-choice but would never have an abortion is something I have heard repeatedly throughout my life. The statement seems to epitomize a yes but feeling that so many people have about abortion. It's a statement full of ambiguity. Implicit in this seemingly supportive statement, affirming the need to keep abortion legal, is a subtle judgment of the women who have abortions. To say that you support abortion as a legal option, but that you personally would never have one, is also to imply that there's something morally wrong with having an abortion, and thus with the women who have them. I pressed a friend of mine who said this to me recently about what she meant by the statement. Her response was, well, I just can't imagine being in a situation where I wouldn't be able to welcome a child into my life. Even though this woman is a dear friend and a politically active pro-choice clergywoman, there was a need to clarify, to distance herself from the circumstances of abortion. The not-so-subtle subtext of this sentiment is that abortion is okay for those people, but not for me. There is a clear posturing in this statement, a distancing between those of us who have children and those who have abortions. This posturing is possible because so many people keep silent about their abortions and because most people don't know that 60% of women who have abortions already have children. As my friend and I talked, we acknowledged, already have children is going to be it for today. Ready? Terry and I are going to read together a Dory Previn song set of lyrics called Did Jesus Have a Baby Sister?
Don't worry, we're not going to sing.
All right.
Did Jesus have a baby sister? Was she bitter? Was she sweet?
Did she wind up in a convent? Did she end up on the street?
On the run?
On the stage? Did she dance?
Did Jesus have a sister?
Did they give her a chance?
Did he have a baby sister? Could she speak out by and large?
Or was she told by Mother Mary, ask your brother, he's in charge.
He's the chief. He's the whipped cream on the cake. Did Jesus have a sister?
Did they give her a break?
Her brother's birth announcement was pretty big, I guess.
But she got precious little notice in the local press.
Her mother was a virgin when she carried him therein.
If the little girl came later, then was she conceived in sin?
And in sorrow, and in suffering, and in shame. Did Jesus have a sister?
What was her name?
Did she long to be the Savior, saving everyone she met?
And in private to her mirror did you whisper, Saviorette?
Savior woman, Savior person, save your breath. Did Jesus have a sister?
Was she there at his death?
And did she cry for Mary's comfort as she watched him on the cross?
And was Mary too despairing? Ask your brother, he's the boss. He's the chief. He's the man. He's the show. Did
Jesus have a sister?
Doesn't anyone know? We're going to begin my talk today with Jennifer singing some words from Holly Near's Mountain Woman song.
I have dreamed on this mountain since first I was my mother's daughter, and you can't just take my dreams away, not with me watching. You may drive a big machine, but I was born a great big woman, and you can't just take my dreams away without me fighting. This old mountain raised my many daughters. Some died young, some are still living. If you come here to take our mountain, well, we ain't come here to give it. I have dreamed on this mountain since first I was my mother's daughter, and you can't just take my dreams away, not with me watching. No, you can't just take my dreams away without me fighting. No, you can't just take my dreams away.
Thank you, Jennifer. These lyrics were among my first thoughts upon hearing the news on June 24th of this year that the Supreme Court had overturned Roe v. Wade. Though this calamitous court decision was anticipated by many, me among them, the news of its coming was a shock to the nation. It called to mind for me another fateful day in June 30th of 1982. This was a day the Equal Rights Amendment was pronounced dead, not having been ratified by the requisite 38 states it takes for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. The American habit of ignoring, repealing, or trivializing women's rights has its roots in an exchange between Abigail and John Adams. Abigail wrote to John in 1776, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention are not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to any laws in which we have no voice or representation." John writes in response to that, "I cannot but laugh. You are so saucy. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems." He concluded that giving women more rights would subject men to the tyranny of the petticoat. However, in a letter to a friend, John Sullivan, he gives a different reason for not having the franchise extended to women, that wives are too dependent on their husbands to make independent choices. Which is, by the way, what he also used as his reasoning for not giving unlanded men the right to vote. Years ago in my teaching career, I led a number of workshops for teachers at in-service days, some of which were related to the subject of the equality of women. On one such occasion in the mid-1970s, someone brought up the expression, liberated woman. In the front row, there was a married couple, both teachers. I asked the woman a question related to the issue, and her husband interrupted with, "My wife is a liberated lady." I addressed the issue of lady as a role, and then gently asked him why he had answered for her. Another time, when we were revising the wording of the philosophy and statements of purpose of our school, I proposed changing men to people and mankind to humankind. This caused much agitation in 1972. My male assistant principal staunchly supported mankind as meaning everybody. I asked why not replace words that offend some people with words that offend no one. He said he was offended by changing it. I asked in astonishment, "You are offended by the word humankind?" It was finally put to a vote, and the change the wording side narrowly won, with about 90 votes cast. It seems instructive to recount important events on a timeline in our nation's history regarding the legal status of the right to abortion. There was no banning to abortion in the colonial period or in the first 70 years of us as a nation. Then, in 1947, the American Medical Association, known as, of course, the AMA, was formed. This exclusively male club, exclusive since Elizabeth Blackwell became the first female medical doctor 2 years later, appropriated the power to regulate abortion, though few of their number had expertise in reproductive health. They scrutinized the practitioners of midwifery and women who had been attending to reproductive needs of women in matters of contraception and abortion, and declared them wanting. The AMA began a campaign to stigmatize and criminalize abortion, so that by 1980, laws restricting abortion access became the norm. By 1910, abortion laws were nationwide, with the only exception to abortion being a danger to a mother's life, a decision, though, that only doctors had the power to make. Anthony Comstock, a New York activist against vice, convinced the legislators of the United States to pass a set of federal acts in 1873 suppressing trade in and circulation of obscene literature and articles of immoral use. The Comstock laws criminalized any use of the United States Postal Service for, quote, any items of obscenity, contraception, abortifacients, sex toys, and personal letters with sexual content or information about the above. Some of the penalties for conviction of breaking these laws included 5 years of hard labor. Comstock was named an agent of the post office, and until 1972, the last remnants of the Comstock laws regarding contraception in Massachusetts and Connecticut were ended with a Supreme Court decision called Eisenstadt versus Baird. It's impossible to measure the level of harm done to women by Anthony Comstock and his powerful enablers for the harrowing 100 years between the enactment of the Comstock Law in 1873 and the Roe decision in 1973. Another villain in the assault on women, their bodies, and their basic rights is Horatio Robinson Storer, who in 1857, as a 27-year-old medical graduate from Harvard Medical School, attended the annual AMA convention. He urged a number of delegates to take a stand against abortion, which he said was against, quote, nature and all natural instincts, and against public interest and morality. His efforts caused the AMA to agree to study criminal abortion. The convention leader asked Storer to chair the effort. Based on the work of this committee, the AMA and its many male doctors took the lead in publicly opposing abortion. In 1859, the AMA declared nothing scientific happened when a woman felt the fetus move. The quickening is what often that's called, as the fetus has been growing and changing well before that. Doctors posited that they were dedicated to preserving life even at its beginning. Thus, the AMA strove to criminalize abortion during this century that saw so many restrictions enacted that caused untold hardships to women until 1973. We will not allow the June 24th, 2022 backlash to have a decade of life, let alone the more than a century of life that Storer's and Compact's misogyny visited upon us. It would be negligent of me to fail to put in some perspective the role of churches have had, particularly the Catholic and evangelical ones, in this abortion issue. The Catholic Church has a long history of fixation on sex as sin. St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 of the Common Era, said that abortion was not homicide, but if resorted to hide a fornication or adultery, it would be a grave sexual sin. St. Augustine, who was decidedly lustful in his youth, saw sex as quite sinful after his conversion. In full disclosure, I will confess to having lived according to the rule of St. Augustine as a Dominican nun. My novice mistress liked my voice, so I was frequently tasked with reading aloud various spiritual books during meals. I think it was on Saturdays that the rule of St. Augustine was read. We didn't talk to each other during meals except on feast days. Early in our relationship, I told Jennifer about that practice and what the rule of St. Augustine said about returning to the regular order of things after feast days. And this became Jennifer's favorite quote from St. Augustine. When the feast day is over, we return to our more austere but happier way of living. Please pardon the digression. It was a temptation I couldn't resist. Now, to St. Thomas, whose life spanned the middle of the 13th century. Though he was not a biologist, he taught that the embryo was a vegetative soul at first, then progressed to an animal soul, and was only a human soul when fully formed. Nevertheless, in spite of that being the prevailing teaching from 1500 to the present, excommunication has been and is the punishment for abortion in the church. This punishment, in spite of the fact that the prohibition of abortion has never been declared an infallible teaching. That means it was not an ex cathedra teaching, an official from the chair of St. Peter teaching, that would be necessary to make it an article of faith. We turn from the instances of working against women's rights and women's freedoms to the abortion counseling service of women's liberation, formed by a group of women in Chicago in the late 60s. They referred to their organization as the service, but to the world of women who needed them, they were called Jane. A woman seeking an abortion in Chicago was told by doctors or friends to call Jane. someone was always on call and answered with, "This is Jane." The person would facilitate the contact with a provider, and members would help the woman through her procedure. In the beginning, the service worked with doctors, but the costs were very high. Also, some of the doctors were rude and disrespectful to the women. Jane then hired its own provider. When he decided to relocate, the women asked him to teach them to perform safe abortions. He agreed to do this. This was a shocking move in the mid-20th century. But, quote, it also harkened back to the thousands of years that women quietly and often secretly attended to the reproductive needs of each other. Adrienne Rich says at one point that perhaps women have always lied to each other, but women have always whispered the truth to each other. Jane charged $100 or whatever the woman could pay for an abortion. Sonny Chapman was 19 years old, for example, pregnant and terrified. She attempted a miscarriage by jumping off a friend's garage, taking near scalding baths, and drinking quinine, but didn't miscarry. She was referred to an abortion provider who would have charged her $600. She was disconsolate. This was more for her, she said, than 7 months' rent. Finally, Jane was able to help her for what she could afford. By the early 1970s, Jane members were performing up to 300 abortions a day, 3 days a week. On May 3rd, 1972, Chicago homicide detectives arrested 7 Jane women and charged them with serious crimes. Their only hope was a lawsuit called Roe v. Wade, pending before the Supreme Court of the United States. Incidentally, in reading the book Jane Against the World, I found out that one of the 7 women arrested that day was a woman named Sheila Smith. I was rather proud of that. Wasn't me, but...
Could have been.
Yeah. The story of evangelical involvement in the so-called pro-life movement is much more a matter of political exploitation than of religious fervor. Before, and for a number of years after the Roe decision, evangelicals were, quote, overwhelmingly indifferent to the subject of abortion, considering it a Catholic issue. In 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, refused to characterize abortion as sinful, citing, quote, individual health, family welfare, and social responsibility as justifications for ending a pregnancy. In 1971, delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention at St. Louis, Missouri, passed a resolution encouraging, quote, Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility, under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. The convention, hardly a redoubt of liberal values, reaffirmed that position in 1974, 1 year after Roe, and again in 1976. When the Roe decision was handed down, W.A. Criswell, a Southern Baptist Convention's former president and pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, also one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century, was pleased. I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person, he said. And it has always, therefore, seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed. It wasn't until 1979, 6 years after Roe, that evangelical leaders, called upon by ultra-conservative activist and founder of the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, seized upon abortion as a rallying cry. Not because they were morally offended or outraged, but because it was used as a tactic to defeat the Democratic President, Jimmy Carter. The election of several pro-life candidates in 1978 was what convinced Weyrich that the issue was potent. He knew that being anti-abortion was more acceptable than the real motive of the ultra-right, protecting segregated schools' tax exemptions. The focal point regarding this issue was the Bob Jones University. In May of 1969, a group of African-American parents in Mississippi sued the United States Treasury Department to prevent 3 new whites-only K-12 academies from securing full tax-exempt status. The discriminatory practices prevented them from consideration as charitable institutions, the lawsuit said. The schools were formed in the mid-1960s in response to the desegregation of public schools set in motion by the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. In 1969, the implementation of the desegregation began, and the number of white students in public school in Holmes County, where this lawsuit began, dropped from 771 to 28. The next year, the number of white students in public schools in Holmes County fell to 0. In Green versus Kennedy, in January of 70, a preliminary injunction denied the segregation academies tax-exempt status. Later that year, President Nixon ordered the IRA to enact a new policy denying tax-exempt status to all segregated schools in the United States. On June 30th, 1971, the United States District Court of District of Columbia upheld this new IRS policy. Segregated schools were not exempt. Quote, any person making gifts to such schools could not claim them as tax deductions. According to Elmer L. Rumminger, administrator at Bob Jones University, the IRA action against his school alerted the Christian school community about what could happen with government interference in the affairs of evangelical institutions. That is really the major issue that got us all involved. But Falwell and Weyrich, having tapped into the ire of the evangelical leaders, were also savvy enough to recognize that organizing grassroots evangelicals to defend racial discrimination would be a challenge. It had worked to rally the leaders, but they needed a different issue if they wanted to mobilize evangelical voters on a large scale. One conservative, after the 1978 election in Minnesota, of 2 pro-life candidates, including the one that would replace Hubert Humphrey in the Senate, predicted the opposition to abortion would pull together many of our fringe Christian friends. Roe v. Wade had been law for more than 5 years. In 1982, the university's appeal regarding losing its tax exemption due to its persistent discriminatory racial practices reached the United States Supreme Court. The Reagan administration announced that it planned to argue in defense of Bob Jones University and its racial practices. Now, and when Bob Jones was first asked by the what their racial practices were, they just sent back a notice saying, we do not admit African Americans. So they were put on notice that they had to change those policies. And so then they admitted one African American student part-time. And after a few months at the institution, that black student quit. Then, in order to placate the IRS, they did admit a number of black students, but only married black students because of their fears of miscegenation. And their promise that if anybody would join an organization that would promote the dating or marriage of interracial couples would be expelled from the school. So finally, the IRS was extremely, out of patience, not unlike the present Justice Department with the former president's resisting of the various appeals for his classified documents that he had. Out of patience, they finally told him to pay up, or if you don't change, you have to pay up because you are violating the law. The assaults on women's rights seem to keep coming. We are now entering an era reminiscent of pre-Civil War free states and slave states. Some states are even enacting the remnants of the Dred Scott decision by attempting to outlaw women traveling to free states for reproductive care. We have examined the history of abortion rights and lack thereof in church history and American history. My research for this service has introduced me to so many women whose courage and determination, in the face of overwhelming odds, brought back memories of the consciousness-raising group I was part of in the early 1970s, when the pride in being a woman was palpable. When the Texas court ruled that the Texas abortion in Roe was unconstitutional but declined to forbid its enforcement, the Dallas Morning News wrote, "The controversy over abortion boils down to a single question: which comes first, the woman or the egg?"
Please rise and sing. We are a gentle, angry people. do our time for generosity, I had noticed, I forgot part of, when I did the chalice lighting, I left off part of Sheila's reading. So I'm going to add it in at this time. So that was from the womb. This core, this center of our identity, this womb is ours. Its definition belongs to us. Its history belongs to us. Its invasion, whether penal or legislative or judicial, is an assault. To allow it, to endure it, to even debate it, is out of the question. I'm thankful for coming of age during the time of reproductive freedom for women. I was with a group of women the other day, and I said, I don't actually know anyone who had an abortion. And one of the women looked at me and said, now you do. She had to go to New York during that time. Those were the times we lived through. I'm thankful to the organizations and individuals who fought and worked to protect and advance women's reproductive health, self-determination, and dignity as basic human rights. The Center for Reproductive Rights, Planned Parenthood, NARAL, Pro-Choice America, ACLU, to name a few. Our own UU faith has a proud history of organizing to establish and defend reproductive rights. UUA was the first religious denomination to formally support a woman's right to choose in 1963. Members of the Dallas UU congregation were party to the amicus brief to the SCOTUS in Roe versus Wade. As UUCF member, I and others were active in the past campaign to put reproductive freedom on the ballot for the people of Michigan to decide. As of this time, the Reproductive Freedom for All constitutional amendment will not appear on November ballot after the Michigan Board of State Canvassers tied on a Tuesday afternoon vote. The decision is expected to be appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court. The initiative collected nearly 800,000 signatures, of which the Michigan Bureau of Election estimates around 596,000 were valid, exceeding the 425,059 needed to be on the ballot. We await that decision. Needed, your gifts of generosity, which allow us to carry on as a liberal beacon in this community. Donations can be placed in the basket at the back of the sanctuary, or they can be made online at the website, uuflint.org, or mailed to the church office. And thank you, your support is greatly appreciated. The lyrics to our next song, which will be sung by Dan Garrix, Step by Step, were found almost word for word in the preamble to the Constitution of the first mine worker union in the U.S., written in 1870. Pete Seeger put the words to a tune. It's a traditional Irish song written during the Great Irish Potato Famine in the 1840s. These few simple lines sum up not only what unions are all about, but what all kinds of shared struggles for social justice encompass.
Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Many drops can turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Many drops can turn a mill, singly none, singly none.
closing words are a poem called And She Grows. The narcissistic sky stares hours on end into the pond, reaches down with fingertips of rain to touch, possessively, admiring. She ripples, and he, angry that he can no longer see himself, sends down a storm, and she grows.
Please join me as we extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.